I hate to disrupt all of this fabulous socializing. We've heard from several of our speakers how important that social cohesion is to making progress and accelerating decarbonization. So there will be plenty more of this to come. I will start by, we're going to share a video. A message from Chuck Keiper, Executive Director at NOPEC, our esteemed host city sponsor. While Chuck is so sorry he cannot join us in person today, he's provided us with this recorded message for you all.
Welcome to Cleveland and the 2024 Climate Leadership Conference. I'm Chuck Keiper, CEO of NOPEC, a regional council of governments and energy aggregator established 25 years ago. I can't join you in person today due to prior travel commitments, but I'm honored to address you virtually at this remarkable gathering. As one of the largest governmental energy choice aggregations in America, NOPEC proudly supplies electricity and natural gas to over 2 million people, residents and small businesses, in 240 Ohio communities and growing. We are proud to be the host city sponsors for this conference. The themes and session topics focused on pathways to net zero, cross-sector collaboration, and managing climate risk resonate profoundly with NOPEC's values and our strategic direction towards a sustainable future. We are dedicated to making a positive impact by supporting our communities in their decarbonization pathways through clean and renewable electric product offerings, educational resources helping our communities and customers reduce their carbon footprints, and advocacy for legislation to make it easier and more affordable for Ohioans to live and operate sustainably. In the past 10 years alone, we have awarded nearly $50 million in energy efficiency grants to member communities and have financed over $10 million in low-interest energy efficiency loans to our small business customers to help them reduce their carbon footprints. NOPEC recognizes that we have an important role to play in this critical resiliency and sustainability journey. To that end, we are committed to taking the necessary steps to work towards a target of net zero by 2050. We have a strong partner in our current aggregation supplier, NextEra Energy, the first U.S. utility company to move past net zero to commit to a real zero goal by 2045. Additionally, our Green Community Choice Program has garnered immense support, with 4 member cities signing up for our 100% renewable content electricity default product. We are also proud to announce that starting in 2025, we will be ramping up our renewable energy mix in our standard default electric offering using Green E certified RECs, with a goal to reach 50% in 2026. And we know still more must be done. We are commissioning a study to identify RNG generation sites in Ohio. We're advocating for Ohio-based renewable generation, including community solar projects, pushing for siting approval for utility-scaled solar farms, including our own proposed 70-megawatt project in Circleville, Ohio. And partnering with NextEra to set aside NOPEC customer funds into a trust dedicated to building new U.S. utility-scaled renewable generation. To date, nearly $100 million has been contributed into that trust on behalf of NOPEC customers. While you're here, I encourage you to connect with NOPEC's dedicated team, including our partners at NextEra and our first Director of Resiliency and Sustainability, Deepa Vedavayas, and our Director of Community Investment and Economic Development, Aaron Marcovi. We extend our gratitude to the Climate Registry for bringing such an important conference to Cleveland, and to Mayor Bibb and County Executive Chris Ronayne and their dedicated staffs for their ongoing collaboration and commitment to climate action. Enjoy your time in Cleveland, and thank you for joining us on this sustainability journey. Together, we are making a difference.
Thank you again, NOPEC, for your support and for being our host city sponsor. And the entire Cleveland community really has been so warm and welcoming, as we've heard, since we've been here. I am really pleased and excited to introduce this next topic to you all. We have a great group to share with you the power of storytelling to advocate climate justice. So with that, I will invite our panelists up to the stage and hand it over to our facilitator, Rhonda Lee Chapman, Associate Vice President of Equity and Belonging for the Trust for Public Land. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
After you. Thank you. Greetings, everybody. How are we feeling? A little sleepy? We do have the honor to be here. I'm super excited about it, and I kind of want to get started to make sure we have your full attention by doing a quick little icebreaker type thing with you, if you don't mind. I know that the world is not binary in nature, but I'm going to ask you a very basic question, and then I'm going to invite you all to talk about your answer. Raise your hand if you are a beach person. All right. Now raise your hand if you're a mountains person. Raise your hand if you said both. What I'd love for you all to do just quickly is turn to the person sitting next to you and talk about what is it about those locations that bring you just a spark of joy. Real quick.
It's a fun question.
How about you, Eddie?
If we talk on these, does it light up? It doesn't seem so.
It doesn't seem like it.
So, mountains, I like kind of the pastoral beauty, I guess the trees that you get, and like looking at the kind of height elevation of it all.
Yeah.
What do you enjoy?
I love the mysteries and the ability to explore and wander, connect, get lost.
Beaches are joyful to me too. I like making. It's a very childlike nostalgia, making sandcastles on the beach and watching them wash away. It's very kind of therapeutic.
That's cool.
All
I
right.
always get anxious on the beach.
Oh yeah, too big of expanse of water.
Okay, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. I love it. I love it. I love it. That, friends, is the power of storytelling right there, right? That is the power of connection. That is the power of just sharing your lived experience. It's everything, right? So I'm just going to kind of kick the conversation off before we turn things over to Sonrisa and Eddie. And we're all going to kind of engage. This is a conversation. If you want to change your chairs around or get comfortable, feel free to do so. You know, yesterday, a few of us who were here, many of us in fact, had an opportunity to hear from Mayor Bibb. And what I really took away from that was the power of the storytelling for him. He was telling us a story about going door to door and speaking with residents and learning more about how climate change impacts were affecting them. And we heard him tell us that he never imagined himself being a climate mayor, quote unquote. And yet after he engaged in that powerful storytelling with his constituents, he found out that there really wasn't much more that he can be than a climate mayor. And so that is advocacy in action. And what I'd like to share with you all, and I hope you agree, is that storytelling is an art and a science, frankly. Not everybody's really great at it. We all have our strengths, or our ministry as we like to call it. And I think that I want to share with you a couple of tools that you can keep in mind when you're thinking about using storytelling as a practice for advocacy and certainly for connection. So there's a couple of points if you feel like keeping them in mind. One of which is it starts with a spark. Like, what is the thing that gets you excited? What is the thing that stirs your soul, your heart, your mind, stimulates your thinking? And then keeping in mind that how we share information really matters if we're really trying to gain impact or have an effect on impact. Another really important element is that storytelling brings humanity to the work that we do. It's how people can understand that we are truly holding ourselves accountable to them. By being out, engaging in an exchange, we now have an opportunity to build on the knowledge that we gain, and that's really important. Another thing to keep in mind is that positive or uplifting stories don't deny the hard times. They give us an opportunity to transcend them. So oftentimes people think that when we're telling stories and they're just positive, that we're hiding the hard stuff, and that's not in fact the case at all. But we need these storytelling opportunities to keep us moving forward. So that was a lot, I know. Before we go into storytelling, I want to invite my friends to talk about the way storytelling has been used to, as the title implies, advocate for climate justice and environmental justice. And I would like to invite Sonrisa to share her story, because I know for me, when I woke up 35 years ago, I wasn't thinking that I wanted to work in environmental justice. I think I wanted to be a photographer for National Geographic. That was actually what I was hoping for. It didn't happen. So Sonrisa, I would love to start with you. And what was your spark?
Well, it's so funny because I've actually done one of those like designing your life things. You know, they have like these product design people, and like you can compare your two sides. And one was like, oh, this is what I'm doing now, and the other was to be a National Geographic photographer. So that's like super fun.
Love it.
But yeah, for me, it was actually, it started probably in like 6th grade or something like that. And this is the gift of having environmental educators and having them come into schools. So we had a guest teacher. They came in and they had what seemed like a clear jar. You know, it would have been kind of like this, but it was like brown and kind of cloudy inside. And I was like, what's that? And hey. And then they were asking, so like, what's in the jar, kids? They're like, what do you think's in there? And I was like, I don't know, what's in the jar? Like, it could, who knows? Like, what's in the jar? Somebody tell me. And this was the 90s in Denver, and we had a really awful brown cloud going on at that time. And they were like, that's Denver's brown cloud. And I was like, what? You know, like, that's the air around Denver. And as you come in from the mountains, mountain person, as you come in from the mountains, you can see it hanging over the city, and especially at that time. You could really see it. And it was a lot of, what I know now was like PM 2.5 and a lot of other pollutants that had come from cars and so on. And they had, you know, they told us like, oh, this is pollution that comes out of the tailpipes of cars and probably other things, but that was what I held on to. And so when I'd be driving down or riding along in a car with my mom, you know, or my parents, I'd look out the window and see all these other cars and all these other tailpipes, and I was like, oh, you know, giving them the malo ojo. That's what we call it in Spanish, you know, when you're like giving them the evil eye. And then I was like, oh, wait, I'm in a car too. And we also have a tailpipe that's also dumping air out into the world and polluted air. And so for me, I was like, okay, I really want to find the compromise. How do I move around? How do I get this mobility? But how do I not have the impact that it's having on our community? And really that set me down a path for environmental action that I pursued and work on until this day.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. Yeah. Eddie, what's your story? What's your spark?
So for myself, I didn't grow up with environmentalism. I'm the son of immigrants growing up in Texas originally. My parents immigrated from South Korea to go to the University of Texas, which is why I was born in Austin. And then instead of pursuing their graduate degrees of pharmacology and engineering, my mother and father ended up opening liquor stores instead in North Texas. So that was my childhood, just in that worldview of essentially telling stories with my sister in the back of a liquor store, you know, trying to amuse each other with bits and pieces drawn. And over time, as a self-taught artist, I've come to be exposed to environmentalism, environmental justice issues, I would say well into adulthood. So for me, maybe the spark was upon graduating from law school, being able to work at a nonprofit at the height of the Great Recession, so this was 2009. So being able to interact with community activists, particularly in Bayview Hunters Point of San Francisco, where I'd moved, and understand issues between Black, Brown, and Asian communities was actually a large part of my kind of formative experiences in environmentalism, and how eventually I grew into, as a community storyteller, by continuing to evolve my art and create the comics that exist today.
I love it. Thank you. I think for me, it was coming fresh out of high school and wanting to find a job that was outside somehow, some way. And I got a job canvassing for Greenpeace because it sounded like that was the right thing to do at the time. And this is back in the late 80s. And there was a campaign that was happening at that time about cigarette butts, and how cigarette butts were being picked up by birds and to build their nests, but the nicotine and the toxins that were captured in the filters were causing all of the bird feathers to come off of the baby chicks after they were born, which just seemed like a really devastating experience. And then, so it was like that connection with animals and nature. And then there was also the justice and representation piece around, and the equity piece. When we would go out to go canvassing, and I was the only black girl on the vans as we're going out to Northern Virginia. And I had people that wouldn't open their doors to me. I had people that didn't believe that I was actually there on behalf of the environment. And perhaps there was somebody around the corner who was gonna come in and rob them. And so I never met my quotas. And so then it was turned into a different kind of reality for me where I'm trying to do good. Now I'm having to understand kind of the racialized dynamics that I was being exposed to, because people used to think that people of color didn't care about the environment, and everybody in here knows that's just simply untrue. So that was, for me, something that was my spark. So like now here we are, right? The three of us and many folks in the audience, and we're doing what we can to advance environmental justice. And so, you know, we fast forward, now it's 2024. We both have, all three of us, have been working in various formats, various organizations and the like. But I want to hear from you all, when you think about the environmental justice work that you've been doing and currently are doing, how equity and justice can become a core part of policy, how equity and justice can be a part of attracting funding or not in some cases, and how we can actually use them as vehicles for implementation. And I'd love to start with you, Eddie, this time.
So maybe to describe my nonprofit's work a bit more, the last 15 years of my life have been dedicated to an environmental justice nonprofit in San Francisco called Brightline. We essentially do two buckets of work. One is sometimes what I term as direct services, so that act of delivering services directly to the community, things like air quality monitoring, job training, youth leadership and education. We also do policy work, which is largely that kind of skill set of being at a computer, typing it away, emailing, calling folks, educating perhaps on behalf of the environment with policymakers. But we work in a broad array of spaces, so things like IRA funding for sustainable rehab and trying to figure out how to connect affordable housing developers who own real estate portfolios to that monies. Offshore wind is actually a big picture piece that we've been working on for the state of California, trying to get up to 25% of the state's energy mix as wind turbines, generated off the coast of California, as well as making sure the equity concerns are addressed. So if there can be community benefit agreements cut from these projects, and in other words, like workforce agreements too, that can also hopefully benefit local impacted communities. So it's through that kind of blend of skill sets, community organizing, policy research analysis, and the direct services component that I've thought a lot about the context, the larger arc of my work, how to make environmentalism real to local communities. But it doesn't happen, I think, without community storytelling. And that's partly why, it started out with a small Instagram account in 2020, where I started publishing essentially the larger arc of my life and the nonprofit work that I do, trying to explain the why of it all, why I even care about all this in the first place.
I love it. So Nisa, what about for you? What are you seeing? What kind of trends?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So right now I work for the U.S. Department of Energy, and we've really been able to have the intersection of the two through the Justice 40 initiative in a really beautiful way. So Justice 40, I'm sure most people here are familiar, but Justice 40 is trying to drive 40% of the benefit of federal spending in certain categories to what we've probably not very well named disadvantaged communities. Because this impacts funding that goes to organizations like the Department of Energy, and some of the covered programs are climate change and clean energy, that pretty much covers everything that we're doing. And so now you have this intersection of disadvantaged communities with climate and with clean energy. And so that in a way has kind of created this nexus by default. But I think the root of your question initially was like, how does equity help galvanize funding? How does it help galvanize policy? How does it help move that together? And I think the part that is at the crux of that for me and my experience has really been while we have that intersection right now, and it's a great intersection, I think the reason is why, or the real question is why is that really valuable. And I think there's an element, at least for my life, that I think explains it. One time I was walking down the street coming from a Bronco game. Go Broncos. I know I'm in Cleveland territory, in Browns territory, but go Broncos. But we were walking back from one of the games, and there was a tree that had a low branch, and it was like the perfect height and for me to be able to jump up and feel really big and tall and like grab a leaf off the tree as like the mindless thing. Something that people probably do all the time, grab something, and just keep going. And after I did that, my mom goes, "Oh, that tree is probably smarting from where you did that." And that was a really powerful moment for me that sticks with me today, that really just shows that, like, in my upbringing, and that was one moment I remember, but I'm sure it's one of many, right? Where it's like seeing the tree as a being and seeing nature in general as a being. My grandfather would teach me when we were fishing, like, talk to your worms. That's the only way you're going to catch a fish, And so I would, like, talk to the worm and be like, "I'm so sorry, I'm driving this hook through your body, but, like, I want to eat, today. Help me get some food for my family, And so there's this grounded nature, and it's not like my family would necessarily call themselves environmentalists. They're not necessarily going to be like, "Oh, I'm an environmental justice advocate," or my dad would make fun of me for recycling sometimes, but there's this innate, ownership within the Latino community, and I think I've experienced this in other communities of color that I've been working with, that is a connection to the land and a connection to place. That's really important, and I think that has been, the environmental movement has not had the language or the cultural relevancy to be able to connect in with these other communities that really do have it, also innately in their ways of being, their food, their music, their ways of interacting in the world. And the environmental justice, climate justice spaces, I think really does tap into that or begin to excite that spark. And so when you're able to connect in this way, you activate entire populations that have been left out of the climate and environmental movement to date. And so I think it's been a real great moment in time through things like Justice 40 Initiative, things like different types of climate justice efforts, environmental justice efforts that are kind of awakening a sleeping giant, if you will, for this part of the work in our world that needs to happen.
I appreciate that. And it's interesting, the disconnect that happens with the people who are making a lot of these policy decisions and the folks who are most impacted by those decisions, right? And the lack of relationship. And I know at Trust for Public Land, we are kind of proud to say that we put community at the center, and we have an effort where we kind of take a package of information where we use research and storytelling and even a podcast and in some instances music to kind of help connect with some of these decision makers. So as we're talking about how we're able to transform and influence policy, when you take that sort of package of information to policymakers, and then you also introduce them firsthand to their frontline constituents, like we do at TPL annually. We have this Day on the Hill event where we bring the people themselves. We don't need to speak on their behalf. They have their own voices, they have their own lived experiences, and it's a really transformational thing to observe when you see a legislator or a member of Congress or even their senior policy staff speaking face to face with somebody who lives in their district, in their jurisdiction, to say, "Hey, listen, I'm really glad you're here. I need you to do better. I need you all to dig in a little bit deeper because this is what's happening for me and my family and my community." And that's one of those ways where we've been able to witness a lot of bills and acts be introduced, Justice 40 being one of them, to Congress. And that is the power, again, of storytelling for advocacy, is giving them the direct access to the people that are experiencing them, the impacts of the things that we're putting them through climate change. It's so sad. But for me, it's really about kind of connecting with you around the head and the heart and the hands all coming together. It is a package. We are that ecosystem. So thank you both. You all talked about your sparks, and I talked about my sparks, and I think we all have different methodologies or approaches that we use for our storytelling platforms. So, it's our work that we do, we write our papers, we write our reports, et cetera. But then we have these other ways of communicating that I would love to hear you all talk about. And I'll talk about mine afterwards. But I want to start with you, Sonrisa, and then Eddie, would you share?
Yeah, I've actually been in the privileged position where I've gotten to meet some of the most incredible frontline leaders, in particular across Texas and Louisiana, a little bit in Denver and a little bit in California and some other places. But in particular, the ones that have really struck me have been those in Texas and Louisiana along the Gulf Coast. And in my work, I tend to be the collector of stories and then building platforms for them to be able to share those back out. And then also a big caretaker of them as well. In many of the places that I go and tend to be, in government, I don't get to be the advocate now, but I get to be the relayer of the story. And so therefore I have to be able to do that. I'm a caretaker of the story. And so I have to do that honorably and justly, I think, for the people that entrusted those stories with me. So one of my biggest platforms for this was last year during our Energy Justice to the People Roadshow, which we did for DOE. And what we were trying to do was anticipate where a lot of our investments were going to go for carbon management and for hydrogen, which have been two of our biggest controversial technologies that the Department of Energy is funding. And we anticipated that these technologies would likely follow existing infrastructure and geology across the country. And so we anticipated quite a bit of it would end up in Texas and Louisiana along the Gulf Coast. And we did a series of roadshows that started in the Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville, Texas, and went up and around the bend. And so we went through Corpus and Port Arthur, Texas, and then Lake Charles, Louisiana, into the river parishes. And we also did kind of a smaller roadshow branded event in New Orleans. And that was an incredible responsibility for me. I had done a lot of our pre-work, getting out on the ground, connecting with the people there, trying to figure out what is the state, what are the conditions, what is the site characteristics of these places that needs to be told to DOE. And I also wanted to be very careful because these are people that are going to be investing their time, energy, and very limited resources in us and me. And I didn't want to overpromise or try to solve things that the Department of Energy had no authority or power or resource to resolve. But so trying to find that intersection of things was really important. And quite frankly, it felt like a burden until the last day of one of the last roadshow, because I had been entrusted with some really stark and really grave types of experiences that these people had. And through the roadshow, we created places where people could tell the story themselves. One of the most impactful ones was we have, now why am I forgetting? Stage fright. I'll remember his name in a minute. From the Concerned Citizens of St. John, Mr. Taylor, took the secretary around his family, like where his family is buried, at a cemetery that is surrounded on 3 sides by the Marathon Petroleum Refinery. And on the 4th side is a train track where most of the time there's actually a train sitting there. And the cemetery, it's so loud at the cemetery, you can't really even hear someone unless you're standing right next to them from the refinery noise that's happening. And most of the security guards, if you show up there, are kind of looking at you sideways, like, what are you doing here? You know, don't you dare leave off this little patch of dirt. And they'll watch you almost the entire time. And the story that he was relaying about land loss and about the impact of this industry was something that I needed to make sure I created space and fought for that space and time and the calendar for the secretary to be able to hear from him directly in that location. And she's used that experience in her later speeches because it struck her so deeply. And then there's the other things that we had to do through the arc of these events, where multiple days we would have different things built in to different types of engagements. And so we'd build in listening sessions, we'd build in round tables, we'd build in times when DOE's talking out, and we built these really great public forums where people can actually come to a table like what you're sitting at right now and develop a community benefit plan with their neighbors. And they would have to debate and decide what is the best aspect of, which benefits should we all pitch in chips together to ensure that this benefit is a part of our greater plan. And it's now available common license, so all of you can download it from our website if anyone wants to use this tool.
It's on the DOE website?
Yeah, it's on our Office of Energy, Justice, and Equity website, and so you can download it. But these are really great opportunities for people to be able to start these stories with each other and hear what's important within a particular community. But in any case, that was our platform. That's been my main platform. And also I've heard a lot of these stories directly from people and am now trying to share them back out at different places that I'm going with different types of policymakers and funders as well.
You know, a traveling roadshow.
It's a traveling
I
roadshow.
love it. I feel like you should be on a horse with a hat.
All right. I would love that.
You would go for it, I bet it. Eddie, in The Advocate, hopefully you can tell folks about it. You have beautifully weaved together personal anecdotes and moments, as you were sharing at the beginning around your spark, moments of victory and moments of hope. And I'd love for you to share with everybody how you even go about choosing those moments, the stories that you're conveying in The Advocate, and how you are defining the moments so that readers really understand how it can connect with them.
I think it's useful to even start with why comics to begin
Let's do
with. And it, for me, it was about being able to be a visual storyteller, so to show the impacts of climate change as well as the communities, for instance, that my nonprofit works with. And then it's not just about even the art inside the panel, but how the story moves essentially from panel to panel. And then there's a blank space, if you know a comic strip, called the gutter, which is essentially that kind of act of pausing and then being able to juxtapose different scenes, different moments, just to even get a sense of how time moves essentially over the course of a page. So being able to do all that was like environmental advocacy, nonprofit advocacy, was a very grinding process. I had to teach myself, essentially invest over 15 years of drawing and improving my own artistic ability. And even after this talk, I'm happy to show people my original sketchbook and how that art has evolved over time. But part of it was understanding those different stories that I wanted to piece together to ultimately show a conflict that's always existed within my own family about not doing nonprofit work itself. They were not fans of it, to be frank, early on. They thought, for themselves, their metric of success in the United States was always about making money. And then from that context of the liquor store, they wanted to invest what they had in my own education and have me go out become, a typical big firm lawyer or some other kind of money-making machine that they themselves could ultimately take pride in. And it's not to say that's a bad worldview either. It's just very different than obviously the path that I've taken. So part of myself in trying to create these autobiographical comics was a big departure from the early fictional stories I'd experimented on since college. I'd started again publishing these on Instagram. It was only a couple hundred followers in the early days of the pandemic, February 2020. It's grown, I've been surprised by the reaction to it. It's grown to over 80,000 followers. And then usually the process for even getting published by one of the big 5 New York City publishers, currently the book is published by Penguin Random House in the last month, has been kind of a topsy-turvy process. I haven't gotten typical agent and tried pitching the book. Really, an editor at a publishing house found it on social media and then just cold approached me saying, hey, have you thought about adapting this for print? And the good news is, because I'm, again, a self-taught artist, everything was very carefully crafted by hand. So in some ways, the project was fairly ready to go, but it took another 3 to 4 years of back and forth between trying to figure out the legal structures of the publishing industry to finally getting it to the stage where it's at today, which is like a book you can actually get in hopefully most major bookstores in the US. So part of that has been a very joyful process, but also made me realize like the need to tell stories and on a much bigger scale, hopefully, to reach audiences that I normally would not have access to.
Have you ever had anybody come to you and say, hey, Eddie, I would love for you to tell my story using your graphic abilities?
Yes. Short of it is there's no shortage of requests for people to draw, for me to draw them, to do it. Part of the challenge too is like I essentially led two very different lives. One was really focused on the nonprofit, trying to build it up as an organization, and that itself was a intense amount of work. And then the art itself was not easily linked, I would say, to my own nonprofit's work until recently. It's really only in the last few months I've started trying to elevate essentially the work that we do at the nonprofit through the comics. Even attending this conference last year as a panel speaker, I never mentioned it in LA, and so to be able to be here in Cleveland and talk about it now openly, in some ways is a relief.
That's awesome. I love it. I love it. I know at Trust for Public Land, we believe in connecting everybody to the benefits of nature. And as I mentioned earlier, we do like to put community at the center of the things that we do. And I just started to personally have a yearning to speak with most of the people who are inspiring me and others on a day-to-day basis in this environmental space. And I was speaking with one of my dear colleagues in our marketing and communications department, and I said, I mean, we really literally need to bring community voice into the space, and I want to have a podcast. And we did it, and we started a podcast, and it's called People, Nature, Big Ideas. And next month we're celebrating our first year anniversary. But the point of that is to really bring, as I mentioned, these influencers that are talking to us from a range of black birders to cultivating doing land return with some of the tribes up in Maine. We've got folks talking about legislative issues. Today we released a new episode just this morning that is about equitable development in park space. Every year TPL releases its annual park score report. If you're not familiar, you might want to take a look at it. It's where we look at the 100 most populous cities in the country, and they get a ranking based on their park equity. And so having a podcast is the platform that I appreciate because it literally gives me a chance to talk to community, and the way folks have been able to engage with the panelists and the guests has been fantastic. And we even did an episode for leaders here in Cleveland, actually, with the SIAT organization that stands for See You at the Top, and our Ohio State Director, Sean Terry, who's here somewhere, I think. So the podcast is also another opportunity for us to bring voices and use storytelling as a platform for advocacy. So hopefully you all can take a listen. Hopefully you all can take a read. And I don't know how we're going to get on your road show, but somehow, some way, we need to have that experience too. So Nisa, I want to take a little bit of a shift, and this is going to be a question for both of you. I think I'm going to start with Eddie this time, actually. Just do back and forth, back and forth. When you think about stories that can enact change, do you have any specific stories to tell? I think people like to hear evidence. I hear you talking about the storytelling, but I want proof, I want evidence. So how have some of the storytelling opportunities enacted change for you, with you?
So even in the context of the book and Instagram comics, it's been essentially zooming to very individual stories. So for instance, my nonprofit worked a lot with a community leader in Bayview Hunters Point of San Francisco named Dr. Espinola Jackson. She was a long-time Black civil rights leader who had essentially held it down for the community for, probably over 40 years. And my nonprofit was lucky enough to work with her on a number of environmental justice campaigns, shutting down peaker power plants in the southeast sector of San Francisco, arguing for mandatory local hire on public works projects. And it was partly through that history that I wanted to cover in the comics itself, and then being able again to juxtapose it from, that was a 2017, even stretching back to 2009 to current day, like how that style of individual activism continues to influence what I do today has been a really important part of the storytelling that I do. Part of it is also just being able to zoom out to, images. I feel like there's a lot of information fatigue in today's social media ecosystem. So trying to present it in a very different way, whether it's like rising sea level, orange skies above California and Manhattan more recently. So trying to juxtapose that imagery together to give a sense of urgency to the climate crisis is also part of the storytelling that I do. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, I want to be able to continue to zoom out to system level actions that we should all be collectively participating and pushing forward, as well as focusing on individual leaders to humanize the work that we do too. I think that's all very important.
And thank you. So, Enrisa, earlier you were talking about sharing one of the stories with, I think it was your director, who is now including that story of Mr. Taylor, is that right? And some of the public presentations and dialogues that she's a part of. And that feels impactful. And I'm wondering if there are other stories that you can offer about how any of your efforts in working with the community and the things that they've brought to bear have also enacted additional change. And it could be on the local level, it could be on the federal level, even the state level.
Yeah, there's been so many. One of the ones that, Mr. Taylor made a huge impression on the Secretary of Energy, and was able to, in her industrialization speech that she gave at the press club, she quoted him, brought up to his story, which is incredible. But that's just how impactful it can be to get to know your neighbor. And you all started to talk about, oceans or mountains kind of a thing, that you probably learned something really impactful that maybe you'll take with you today even. And one of the ones that has really impacted me has been from Rashida Oizain in Sulphur, Louisiana. And she's told us a story, but one of which was, it was about her son, one of her, I think 6 kids, she has a lot of kids. There's a huge bridge that goes over the Mississippi River there in Sulphur. And as her son was coming down that bridge, he basically passed out in his car and wrecked it on the base of the bridge. And what they have later found out is that he has epilepsy, and they do think that a lot of the health conditions that he and her kids have all been experiencing are due to the environmental pollutants in their area. Combine that with another woman who I've met there in Lake Charles, North Lake Charles, who is telling me, just in passing almost in conversation, I have to figure out how I'm going to be able to get LIHEAP for next week. On her way to meet us, by the way, at a meeting that we were calling. And I think I'm going to get it, but it won't start till the beginning of next month. And so I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do for the next week, because the month didn't start for another week or so.
Does everybody know what LIHEAP is?
LIHEAP is the assistance that the Department of Health and Human Services provides to pay the utility bills for anybody who's falling behind on their utilities. And so these things were striking for me. I have these 2 people that normally are giving up their time. They're leaving sometimes a hospital to call me or to talk with me, or they're extracting themselves from a life of survival to come and invest in us. And that has been really important in our work at DOE, and something that we've taken back, where we've decided that the community groups, the community organizations that we're asking in all of these different ways to participate in community benefit plans. And now in some of these places, we have 6 or 8 different DOE-funded multi-million-dollar, usually billion-dollar types of projects that are going into the same community, and each one of them is trying to engage in the same communities to say, hey, come and talk to us about our community benefit plan. So we recognize that those groups don't have the resources that they need, the technical expertise, the consultants, the legal services, and all of those things to keep up with just DOE projects, let alone the EPA funded and HUD funded and FEMA, all the other stuff that's going on in their communities. So just today, actually this morning, I'm so happy the timing worked out. We just announced the Regional Energy Democracy Initiative that our office and actually our little team who's gone on these roadshows incepted and have now created. that is going to fund $5 million out into the Gulf South of Texas and Louisiana as a pilot to fund community groups directly for community capacity building and technical assistance.
That is fantastic.
And so you can find that out today, but it's a really huge difference and something that even, you know, the highs at DOE are really excited
Will
to
you say
support.
the name of the program again?
The acronym is READY,
Ready.
and it's Regional Energy Democracy Initiative.
Excellent. I'm just looking out, I can see a lot of pens moving. They're either writing love notes or
Or
they're
multitasking, yeah.
they're taking notes.
That's right.
So at the start, that's really powerful. I'm really excited. Thank you both. At the start of this conversation, I had shared a list of kind of storytelling points or key tips. And the one thing that I didn't share that somebody had relayed to me recently, which is that the stories we tell become true. There's a lot of power there because we can also think about a lot of the untrue stories that exist that become normalized and placed upon communities, individuals, types of people, et cetera. And so there's a huge responsibility that you both have, that I have, in the stories that we tell, because for some people that might be the only story they hear. So there's a certain level of kind of guardianship. You were talking earlier, Sonrisa, about how you are kind of the keeper of the stories, and you know, sometimes gatekeeping can be problematic, but in some instances when you're protecting, you know, the individuals, when you're protecting a community, it's very important not to engage in any sort of extractive behavior with the stories that you're told. So there's a lot of responsibility in being a climate storyteller. And I kind of want to hear from both of you how you respect those responsibilities. Eddie, I'm going to start with you.
I'll share a tidbit about my own book, which I think is pretty fascinating to tell to this audience, that as an author with a New York City publisher with a contract that's structured the way it is, I actually do not have control over what goes on the cover. It's ultimately the publisher's discretion. And one of the things they did not want on the cover was climate change itself, which was actually really fascinating to me, that despite the book being largely a lot about environmental justice and climate change policy, they really wanted to focus on the family themes, which I think on a level makes sense because that's how people do get motivated toward climate action, you know, thinking in the context of their children or even generational wrongs done that they would like to right. But one of the struggles I have is like my responsibility of wanting to push the issue forward. And I hope in the interior itself, it makes that clear too, the passions that I have for this. And one of the harder messages to also communicate, even in the context of environmental action I've really struggled with, is the idea of community building. So it's not just about taking care of one's family or future generations of one's own children or grandchildren. Hopefully it's also about, you know, being able to reach across diverse communities and work collaboratively together to address issues we should all care about, like equity and environmental justice. But it's a tough message to, you know, relay, and hopefully, if not this book, maybe the next.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's your story, but then the control, right?
Yeah.
The control of the outsiders. And I think that's something for all of us to think about too, as we're working with communities and the power that we hold, being well-resourced organizations or businesses or the like, and how we need to kind of think about what our motivations and our missions are, and making sure that we're in alignment with communities, so we're not asking them to have to surrender themselves to us fully. So that's really interesting. Thank you. I commend you for going through that whole process with this publishing world. Sonrisa, I know that you have a belief in allowing the communities to speak for themselves. Can you share more?
Yeah, and so I think it's fascinating that they put family on the cover, because when you, to the first kind of nuance of that question of like, how is it that, you know, protect people, it really is about the relationships. And anyone who asks me, how do I go and I do this work properly? I'm like, well, first of all, you have to be willing to change yourself. You have to be willing to invest budget in it and to adjust your timeline. And because this is going to be a relationship that you're committing to, it's not just a transaction. You're not just going in there to trade something. You're going in there to connect, to meet people, to learn who they are. And the family part on the cover really does speak to the relationships that is the relationships are the power of all of this work moving forward. And so I fully intend to still see Mr. Taylor and many of the people across the Gulf South that I've already met, and I want to be able to stand in their presence again and feel that I've done them proper and I've done them well. And so that I try to make sure that any action I do and when I bring them into a space, it's with respect to them, and that whomever might take their story from there is also going to do it with respect. But as far as that last part of and letting communities speak for themselves, too many times we say we're going to empower communities or give them a voice or all of those things. Coming from a red line community, I had a voice already. I just need to be someone just needs to invite me over to come in here. I need someone to listen, not necessarily to someone to give me a voice. And so I think that changes a little bit of that framework, which is we need to invite people to be listeners. And it's not so much of I'm going to give them a voice, but I'll give myself the opportunity to listen and to grow. And I think that's the dynamic that we have to change is where we think the power lies. Because if I'm giving someone a voice, I have the power granting to them, instead of recognizing they already have the power and I need to yield and push back myself, whether that's a big governmental system, a nonprofit organization, or a corporation, to yield to the power of others.
Absolutely, absolutely. Did y'all hear that? Y'all get it? Got it? All right. We have about 3 minutes left, and for some reason I was worried we weren't going to use the time. Hilarious. So I think I'll ask this one final question, and that is about lessons learned, because it's not always glossy, and we definitely make mistakes along the way. And I would love for you both to kind of reflect on, particularly in the space of the storytelling and engaging with community, think about one of the ways that maybe you crossed a boundary, or maybe you jumped outside of your lane, or maybe you took something too far or didn't go far enough. And there was an impact that you were not intending that we could all learn from.
I'll tackle this first. I'm constantly trying to balance between what I'll term as policy speak. So some of the stuff you heard me mention earlier, whether it's offshore wind or energy efficiency, et cetera, versus, this comic stuff, which is in some ways very relatable, fun, to look at and whatnot. But in my mind, it's not necessarily the work itself. It's not the hard work of community organizing or citing an air quality sensor. And so part of, I guess, the learning process for me, I'd like to think there are no true mistakes, that we're constantly in a state of learning and, hopefully improving upon ourselves, is that what is the right balance to strike between the two worlds? I think the hard reality is we live in a very, very noisy information ecosystem. There's a ton of stuff, competing for attention all the time. And it's everything from fictional stories, streaming to, hard policy speak. And so how to cut through that noise, I think, is an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, Sanvisa speaking, I'll share, I think one of my weak spots in this space, working with community and being passionate about advocacy, is I am easily swayed because of my heart. And I get very excited and become very passionate when I'm hearing from communities. And sometimes I have to catch myself from over-promising because I'm so excited. And I'm going to take it back to the office, and I'm going to find this money, and I'm going to find these people, and I'm going to do all of these things that sometimes I can't deliver on. And so for me, my biggest lesson learned is to be very clear about what my own boundaries are, or what the boundaries of an organization might be, because of the different circumstances that we're dealing with in our capacity. And so I do have to watch myself often, every day, pretty much. I was ready to commit money that I didn't have last night just because I was so excited with some of the things I was hearing. And so I wonder if there are other folks in the room that have a similar tendency, and we just have to remind ourselves to pause before we speak. What about you?
Yeah, for me, it's the follow-up part and making sure that you're always there. Sometimes we'll have community members that be hey, I haven't heard from y'all for a couple of months. What's going on? And it's that pausing, not moving, because we were moving way too fast always, to really invest in that follow-up action, and that's actually something that has to be timed for budget, you know, like you have to allocate time, energy, and attention for that, and it's something that I'm not always good at doing, and need to make sure that the communities feel held and cared for following the events and the interactions as well.
100%. I confess, just yesterday, I got a text from my gym that said, "We haven't seen you for a while. We want to know that everything is okay." It was striking, and I immediately responded saying, "But I've been traveling for work, and I promise I'll be there on Tuesday." So follow-up matters. Follow-up matters. So I just want to thank you both, and thank you everybody here for listening to our stories about storytelling. We hope that everybody took away at least one thing, even if it's just why you don't like the beach after all. That's perfectly okay. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Sonrisa. And thank you, Jennifer. It's been a delight.